This winter, we do it all just to change your mind. Find out how to get lasting change. Leave your past, find your future. Get rewired.
We've been in a series called Rewired, and we're talking about learning how to do things differently than we've done before in our Christian life. And when I began writing this series months ago, there was one message that I got stuck. And I knew that if I didn't talk about dealing with disappointment, we weren't moving any further. So I don't know whether you've ever been disappointed or not. I'm not sure if we got the right audience today or not. But I do know this. I know that unresolved disappointment in your life and mine can become the biggest block to moving forward spiritually. So I researched, and I came across some material by a man by the name of Steven Furtick. And I want to share that material with you this morning. And it's based around a parable. Now, a parable is the way Jesus told stories, and he told them in many different dimensions. So a parable is like, when you go into English class, and then you just kind of enjoyed that piece of English until they made you rip it apart and find all the inside meaning and all the things. Where did they get that out of that? Well, that's kind of like what parables are. And here it is right here. It's in Luke chapter 13, verses 16 to 9, and it's Jesus. And he told a parable. A man had a fig tree and planted it in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it, and he found none. And he said to the vine dresser, "Look, for 3 years now, I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down. Why should it use up the ground?" And he answered him, "Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and put manure on it. And then if it should bear fruit next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down." This is a parable about disappointment. Now, I don't know if you've been disappointed with your job, with your family. I don't know if you're disappointed to the person sitting beside you. Say no, you're okay. I'm not disappointed in you. We're okay with that. But in this story, Jesus is walking through the vineyard. And the story about the vineyard is he's been surveying the nation of Israel, and the parable is about the nation of Israel. And he's very disappointed because when he reaches for fruit that the nation of Israel should have been producing, there isn't any fruit. Now, I want to suggest today that you're going to find yourself in one of these three positions. The owner was disappointed. He came looking for something that didn't happen. The manager was disappointing. He couldn't produce what the owner wanted, and the tree was dysfunctional. So I want to suggest that you're going to be one of those three or all of those three. I mean, this week, you're either going to be very disappointing to someone because you haven't lived up to their expectations. You may be disappointed because that person may not have seen what they wanted out of you and you didn't see what you wanted out of them. Or you may be dysfunctional. But you're going to be there in one of those three this week. So when Jesus is walking through the vineyard, and basically the heart of the parable is this: whatever does not produce is frustrating. It's the core of disappointment. And Jesus is walking through and he's looking at the vineyard and he comes to this one fig tree and he reaches for it and there's nothing there, and he makes this incredible statement to the manager. He said, "Listen, it's either going to grow or it's going to go." And that's the heart of the parable. Either you and I are going to figure out how to grow through our disappointment, or our life is going to stop and nothing is going to happen. Dead things take up space in our lives. And if you won't deal with your disappointments, it will continue to take up space and more space. So here's Jesus. He's walking through the vineyard, and he's looking at the vineyard as the nation of Israel. And really all of this began back with a guy by the name of Abraham. And God made a promise to Abraham. He said, you will be a seed, and from you all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. And he picked Abraham to bless a nation, and he picked the nation of Israel to bless the world. But here's Jesus, and he's standing here looking, and he's saying this. Listen, he says, whatever I wanted to happen has not happened. The poor are not being blessed. They're being oppressed. The law that I gave to show you the way to righteousness is being used to abuse people and create guilt. And the tree in the parable represents the leadership. And you say, why a fig tree? Well, interestingly enough, in the Bible, a fig is the symbol of peace. Now, maybe you've remembered suddenly where you first heard of fig trees in the Bible. That was where Adam and Eve, after they had sinned and disobeyed God, the leaf that they cut to cover their shame was a fig tree, the leaf of peace. So here's Jesus. He's walking through this, and he's basically looking at the leadership. He's looking at the nation of Israel. And I always am amazed at how relevant the Bible is. Because Jesus is basically saying, when the leadership is not producing according to its purpose, the people suffer. Bad leadership corrupts possibility. And God is still looking for leaders today. He's looking for leaders in the home. He's looking for leaders in business. He's looking for leaders in the community, because everything, as John Maxwell says, rises and falls on leadership. Bad leadership corrupts possibility in a nation, a people group, a world, a church, a religious community. And when leaders fail, everything suffers. So I'm giving you that background so that when we get very personal about this parable, and we're going to do that next, I want you to know what the whole basis of the parable is. So here's Jesus. He's walking through the vineyard. And I want you to imagine with me, he's walking, he's inspecting, he sees the figs, and he reaches out with his hand, and he looks at a tree, and there's nothing on the tree. And here's the story in Luke 13 and verse 6. And he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it, and read the last line, and found none. So the owner knew what he had planted. The owner came along and he said, listen, this is what I've done. I've planted figs, and here is a tree that's not producing figs. So here's a big idea for you this morning. God does not pick what he doesn't plant. See, some of you today are so busy trying to produce something that God never planted in you. You're basically trying to be someone or something you are not. And your disappointment comes because what you're trying to produce is not happening in you. And basically, you're spending all your energy and all your effort and all your hard work, and you're producing pomegranates, when God really wants you to produce figs. And you're so busy trying to produce something God never planted. And disappointment is trying to produce something that isn't in your destiny. So, my simple example for some of you, you need to stop singing. Just stop singing. You know what I mean? Just, it's not in your destiny. Serve in kids' church. Serve in ushering. Go make coffee. But just stop doing what you want to do and figure out what God designed you to do. So much of disappointment is wrapped up inside the fact that we want to do something, but it's not necessarily what God has tried to put in your life. Years ago, I stopped apologizing for what I wasn't good at. I used to try to fix things. And I mean, I am so bad at fixing things. And when I would get frustrated, I would say, I'm no good at that. Someone once said to me, Jeremy, you need to stop, confessing or talking about what you're not good at and start to talk about what you are good at. And I remember I had the plumber over to the house and the water tank downstairs was leaking, and he came, zipped on by and put a little wrench on it, tightened it up, and he said, hey, gee, Mr. Mahud, you could have fixed that and saved yourself $120. And I said, well, I don't fix things, but I'm a darn good piano player. And he kind of looked at me, and we walked upstairs, and at that time I had a big black grand piano in my living room, and I walked by it, and I sat down, and I started to play something, and his jaw dropped. I said, hey, it's easy. Just sit down here. I'll show you how to do it. Push a few keys around, So, oh, no, Mr. Wood, I couldn't do that. I said, exactly right. I'm no good with a Phillips head screwdriver, but give me one of these things. Give me a mic, and I can do something with it. And I've stopped apologizing for what I'm not good at, and thank God, God gave me a wife who can fix things. You see, sometimes you and I are trying to use tools that God didn't authorize us to use. We keep trying to be what we're not. We keep trying to do something in our personality that's not part of our purpose. I'm not an introvert, when I'm up here. But I'll tell you something, the last thing you want is to go and see a speaker who kind of stands here and mumbles, thank you, I'm so glad you're here today. Sometimes you just have to give it up because it's not the way God wired us. And stop wasting our potential that is not in areas of our purpose. You'll always be disappointed when you try to pick something out of your life that God didn't plan. You'll always be disappointed. You'll use up so much energy. And it is, by the way, because this series is, bordering on helping us deal with anxiety, one of the greatest sources of anxiety is trying to be what we are not. Trying to live a life that God has not destined for us to live. It took me a long time to come to realize that God had picked me to do this very job, because I never ever felt qualified or called in my own sense. But God made it very clear to me one night that this is what I needed to do with my life. And when people say to me, how have you spent 40 years doing that? Maybe you don't know the statistics, but 9 out of 10 people who enter the ministry leave the ministry. They don't retire in it. They go and do another job. 9 out of 10. And I've been doing this for 40 years. Why have I been doing it for 40 years? Because I'm stubborn? No, not because I'm stubborn. But because I believe this is where God planted me. This is what God called me to do. Why have I gotten through the rough times, the personal depressions, the times when I didn't want to do this? Because I believe God called me to do this. Why have I survived the valleys? Because I believe God called me to do this. And He hasn't changed that calling on my life yet for me to do anything else. And you and I need to come to grips with understanding God's calling in our life and begin to live out of that. So one of the reasons that you and I experience disappointment is because we haven't really sought out what God wants from our life. We continue doing what we want, and that continues not to produce in the way that we want to produce it. Let's move on through the vineyard. Luke 13:7. And the owner said to the vine dresser, look, for 3 years now I've come seeking fruit on this tree. Say 3 years. 3 years. I've come seeking fruit on this tree, and what happens? I find none. And what does he say? Cut it down. Okay, read the last line. Everybody take a big deep breath. Okay, read the last line. Cut it down. Why should it use up the ground? Okay, so here's the guy. He's in the vineyard, and it's using up good ground. I mean, the amazing thing is all the other trees are producing. Here they are. He looks around. There's a fig. There's a fig. There's a fig. Here's a tree. It's in good ground. It's been planted, but nothing is coming out of it. Okay, number 2, stop using your environment as an excuse why you can't grow. Stop using it. Other people have grown. Other people have issues. Other people have faced trauma. Other people have faced setbacks. Other people have faced brokenness. Other people have faced disappointment. Other people have less experience, education, culture, less loving parents, and they found a way. I was talking to my buddy John, who's Xander's dad. Where are you, John? He's right there. I was talking to John today before church. I said, John, I want to use you as a sermon illustration today, if that's okay. I'm not exactly sure what he would have said if he said no. Probably just been a hole in the sermon. But you know, I've known him for a long, long time. And he's had setback after setback after setback. Some of them are his own making because of his choices. Some of them have been what the environment around him has handed him. But there's one thing that he has done. He has made a decision in his life that he would not allow his environment to define him. And now he's a single dad, young single dad, raising his child, and he's just said, I am not going to allow my environment to define me. I am going to make a decision. I will not excuse my growth by blaming my environment. So here's an idea for you. How about you grow from what you hate? How about you grow from what you hate? The disappointment of the love I didn't get is going to drive me to give a greater love. You know, part of my motivation when I started at All Nations Church, I didn't know how to start a church. I didn't know anything. I'm just a recovering drunk, you know, that God transplanted back to Sudbury. But I knew one thing. I knew I didn't want a church to look like. I knew enough about churches who produce guilt. I knew enough about churches who were judgmental. I knew enough about churches who made all these barriers to entry. I knew about churches who thought they were better than other churches. And I said, I don't want to be part of that. So even though I didn't know what to do, I knew what I didn't want to do. And so we are attempting to build this accepting church, a church of love, a church that embraces people, a church that makes space for who they are and how they come to us. What about parenting? My goodness me. Your parents gave you the exact strategy to be a good parent in reverse. I thought about that. My dad was the most unromantic man in the world. In fact, one year for Christmas, he brought my mother hairnet hairspray. So you can imagine, right, how that went over? Kind of like a lead balloon. He was just so unromantic. And I just remember growing up saying, you know what? And no matter what happens to me, I am not going to be unromantic. I am going to do my best to be as romantic as I am able within the framework of my personality. And I said that today because my wife is not here and you can't ask her afterwards if he's really romantic. But sometimes you and I have to take what it is that has damaged us and has hurt us and what we hate, and we have to say, that's what I'm going to do, the opposite of that. That's what I'm going to become. I am not going to become that abuser. I am not going to allow my environment to define me, because it's not where you're planted that determines if you'll grow. It's your purpose and your perseverance. And by and large, too many of us quit way too soon. About 7 years into All Nations Church, I was extremely frustrated. I was just frustrated with the people. I was frustrated with the leadership. I mean, if truth be told, I was probably frustrated with myself, but I didn't have the courage to admit that. And this little cassette tape, anybody remember cassette tapes? Yeah. Little cassette tape by John Maxwell landed on my desk. And I listened to this leadership tape, and in there, he said something that rocked the foundation of my thinking. And here's the exact quote, and this is from 30 some odd years ago. He said, if you've been in a church 7 years and you're the leader of that church, you own every problem in it. Huh. So you think so? You should come to my board meetings. You should come to that committee meeting. You should see Mrs. Jones. I hope there's no Mrs. Jones here today. Oh, you're not dealing with the people. And it just played over and over and over in my head. And I made this decision. I said, okay, if I'm going to stay here, if this is where God's planted me, there are no more excuses about where I'm at. There's no more excuses about my environment that I cannot grow. Because by and large, most of us just quit too soon. Well, there's an incredible person in this story that I love, and it's the good manager. Here's the good manager. Here's what he says in Luke 13:8. And you know that the owner wants to cut it down, and he answered him and he said, sir, let it alone. Everybody say this year. This year also. I love this line, right? Until I dig around it and put on manure. He's kind of a defiant manager, right? He says, hey, no, boss, we ain't cutting that thing down. No, wait, leave it alone. You know, because he could have just left it alone. He's going to leave it alone and do something, but what happens when you leave things alone in the garden? Huh? Weeds. What happens when you leave things alone? There are weeds. Nothing grows when you leave it alone. Listen to me. Instead of dealing with disappointment, you and I have a tendency to deny it. And nothing, get this, okay, are you ready? Nothing left alone gets better. I'm a guy, I know that. I don't like to go to the doctor. I don't like to go to the hospital. But I've learned that nothing left alone gets better. It's not where you're planted that determines if you will grow. It's your purpose and your perseverance. We can't afford to leave these disappointments alone if we're going to become the people and the person that God has destined for us to become. So the manager says he's going to do two things. Do you remember what they are? I'll put them up. Luke 13:8. He answered him, sir, let it alone this year until I what? Dig around it and put on manure. Can't wait till I get that part. So here's the big idea of the day. It's going to go up on the screen. The problem appeared at the level of the leaves, but the problem occurred at the level of the roots. See, that's why he says dig around it. Where the problem appears is not where we deal with it. Where it shows up is not where it started. Where it shows is not where it grows. It shows on the leaves. Because the fruit you can see is always of a result of the root you can't see. And yet we spend so much of our time dealing with leaves. Some of you have spent 47 years dealing with leaves, dealing with the stuff on the surface, dealing with symptoms, and yet you can't stay at the surface. He says dig around it because he's got to dig around it. He's got to water it. He's got to put manure on it. He's got to go down, and yet you and I stick at the external level. Listen, your disappointment is not with your spouse. Your disappointment is with yourself. That you can't deal with yourself, that you can't manage yourself, that you can't see yourself correctly. And so what do? You take it out on your wife. You take it out on the leaves. You're not disappointed with your job. You're disappointed in yourself, that you don't know how to manage your time. You don't know how to prioritize your time. So then we start screaming at the leaves instead of looking deep down inside ourselves and get to the root. You and I, if we're going to grow, have to stop blaming people, situations, genetics, politics, or your last church. Oh, my last church. You don't know what they did with my kids. Oh, the last church, the preacher couldn't be. Oh, the last church of his. You got to stop Look at, just turn to somebody and say, got to stop blaming. Yeah, just stop it. Stop it. That's even better. I like that. Stop it. Right? So if you want to stand there looking at a barren tree, go on making excuses. If you want to be the same as you are this time next week, this time next month, this time next year, if you still want to be frustrated with your spiritual growth and your emotional growth, go on making excuses. But if you want to find a life, find God, find peace, grow and prosper in the things that matter according to your purpose, you're going to have to stop fussing about the leaves and own your root system. Yeah, thank you. We got it. So the root of your disappointment is your own dysfunction. And if you could deal with your own dysfunction, you could deal with any disappointment. I'll say it again for you. The root of your disappointment is your own dysfunction. And if you deal with your own dysfunction, you can deal with any disappointment. But we got to get down to it. So what does he say? He says, I'm going to dig around it. Here he goes. He's going to dig around it. Okay, it. It is a code word. I'm going to dig around it. It is a code word. Okay, I can't figure out and have enough time to try to figure out all the disappointments that happen in teenagers' lives and young people's lives and old people's lives and middle people's lives, because our church is full of people like that. So it is your code word. Whatever the disappointment is, that's it. It's the code word for whatever is not growing in your life. And today we're going to need to dig around this, dig around my stony heart, the way I've protected this disappointment and protected myself. And I've got to bring that before God. Because if I don't want figs, don't dig. But if I want peace, emotional prosperity, freedom from anxiety, you and I are going to have to dig. See, we look over at other people's figs, right? And we say, oh, look at what's producing in their life. But we don't get an opportunity to see the root work that they've done to produce the fruit that they're producing. We haven't seen where they've got down, where they've wrestled with God, where it's broken their heart, where they say, God, grow me or I'm going to die, where it gets into our heart to such a great degree. God, I need this peace. I need this freedom from anxiety and worry and fear that this disappointment is growing in me. Oh, I know. Some people say, well, I prayed about it, Pastor, for a week. You know, there's an interesting thing in the parable. He says, for 3 years, I've been looking at it. Sometimes this is tough stuff. James says, the book of James says, let patience have its perfect work. And when it's complete, it will bring forth the fruit that it needs to bring forth. Maybe this is your day. Maybe this is your hour to dig. Well, he dug around it. And then what did he do? Do you remember? Put manure on it. He fertilized it. Hey, listen. If any of you know the old King James Bible, that's the one that has all the these and the thous and the thuses. Let's look at Luke 13:8, that part of the parable in the King James Bible. It's priceless. And he answered, saying unto him, Lord, let it alone this year also, till I shall dig about it and dung it. Everybody know what dung is? If you don't know what dung is, just kind of look at your neighbor and they'll clue you in. You know what God does? I can tell you what he's done in my life, right? When I want to start digging, the next thing is God backs up a great big truckload of dung. And he backs it into my life. And this disappointment happens, and that disappointment happens, and this failure happens, and this struggle happens. And it feels like your life is out of control. And there's one great big dung of disappointment that happens in our life. And you know what? That keeps on going until you and I recognize that failure is really fertilizer. That's what it's all about. It's coming to understand that when God allows the dung of our life to be there and we are using our belief in him to dig up and allow living water to flow, it's not until we recognize failure as fertilizer that we will ever move on. I'm going to clean out the rest of the religious people in the church right now. Because whenever crap happens, Anybody had crap happen to them? See, it's not crap, it's compost. It's not crap. It's grounds to grow. It's what's planted in us that allows it to happen. It's not failure, it's fertilizer. And I don't know about you, but I've had times in my life when I've needed to cry out to God, I need some fresh dung. I need to be fertilized, God. I'm getting stale. I'm not producing. There are blocks in my life. There are disappointments in my life. There are discouragements in my life, and they're holding me back. Well, I do have a concern about this parable, because between the owner and the manager, I'm not sure whether God is tired of putting up with me and wants to cut me down, or whether his patience is unlimited. There's a number of ways we could, look at this parable, and there's lots of explanations, but here's the one that I really like. This parable is really about the heart of God. See, here we have the justice of God is the owner, and the mercy of God is the vine dresser. The justice of God comes along and says, cut it down. Why is it taking up good ground? I could grow something good here. I could make this profitable. And mercy and God's love and God's grace stand up. And he says, no, give it one more year. Turn to somebody and say, one more year. One more year. The owner represents God's justice, and the vine dresser represents God's mercy. It was said about Jesus in Isaiah 61:1, the Spirit of God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. Here's what I love. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Listen, what that vine couldn't do on its own, through its own strength, through its own effort, through its own volitional live, grace steps in and does it on their behalf. See, I don't know about you, but I am that tree. You are that tree. For all have sinned. And justice comes along and says, cut it down. But mercy says, no, let me roll up my sleeves. Let me get to it. Let me dig down there. Let me remove anything that stops the flow of living water. I don't know about you, but I need that grace in my life. I need that grace to dig around me where I am hard. I need that grace to dig around me where my mind is closed. I need that grace to dig around me where I'm frightened of what I might find there when I dig. I need that grace. There was another tree also called a cross, and it did produce. It was planted in death and it brought forth life. It was planted in shame and it brought forth glory. And I'm so glad today that God's disappointment in me is not greater than his love. I am so glad that God's disappointment in me is not greater than his love. And I still have a destiny today, despite all of the disappointments and setbacks that I've had in my life. You still have a destiny. You can grow in grace, because grace is the only soil of a life that honors God. So I know that some of you are very disappointed in yourselves today. You're owning a lot of failure. You're owning a lot of setbacks. Your life is not growing where you thought it would grow. You've been in situations that aren't producing what you hoped. I know some of you have planted in the lives of other people. Maybe they've been your kids. Maybe you invested a lot in a relationship. And you just planted and allotted. And when you went to reach for the fruit, there was nothing there. And one of the things that happens when you and I get disappointed is it's easy to quit trusting people. It's easy to quit hoping. It's easy to stop loving people. because our heart has been hurt. But I thank God today for His grace, His undeserved, unmerited favor that He pours into my life. And I just want to declare over you today that this is the acceptable year of the Lord. I want to declare over you that this is your year. This is your year to allow the Holy Spirit to dig up the fallow ground, to water you with His Spirit. This is His year to allow that dung to come into your life if it's not already there. And God is waiting to see what we'll make out of the dirt, the dung, the discouragement, and the disappointment. Because in my deepest disappointments is God's deepest grace. It's the only thing I don't like about this story. And when you get a chance to read it again in Luke 13, you'll find out that we have no idea what happens. And the story just ends. It says, leave it alone, dig around it, come back next year. If it's not producing, then you can cut it down, and the story ends. There's a psalm, the very first psalm in the Bible. It said, blessed is the man, the woman who follows God, because they are like a tree planted by the streams of living water. And I believe today that God is allowing us to be planted by the streams of living water. I believe that God is just waiting to allow the potential He's placed in us to flow from us. And there's still lots of grace in disappointing times. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just want to be that tree. I just want to lift my hands to God's grace. And I want the gentle rain of His love, the sunshine of His Spirit to grow me. And I want to take that disappointment and I want to say, God, just apply your grace to it. Listen, I don't have a psychological answer for you today. I got a Jesus answer. I got a Jesus answer. It's that if we will just raise our hands, if we will just say, Lord, here I am. I don't know what to do with this disappointment, but it's hurting me. It's stopping my growth. I'm growing in other areas, but I'm not growing the way I need to grow. If you and I would just dig a well of worship today. The world is full of disappointment, but in His presence, there is a satisfaction you can't find anywhere else. In His presence is fullness of joy, the scripture says. In His presence. And sometimes when I'm really disappointed and I really don't know how to solve this issue and I really don't know what to do with it, I just go into the presence of God. In the presence of God, I find healing. Would you stand with me, please? And if you know this song, sing out. If not, just say the words. We are standing. Allow the presence of God to flood your life today. Just give it to Him, whatever it is. We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Jesus now, His presence on hold. Just take it up a little bit, John, folks. Come on, just stand in His presence. Soak it in this one. We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus now. We are standing in His presence. We are standing in. We are standing in His presence on holy ground. Oh, Father God, I thank you for your presence in this place today. I thank you for your presence through all the airwaves that we broadcasted on today. I thank you, Lord, that in your presence is fullness of joy and life forevermore. I thank you that you see our disappointments, Lord. You see our struggles. You see our brokenness. And into that you want to pour your mercy, your love, and your grace. Now, Father, give us the courage to allow you to break up our stony heart. Give us the courage, Lord, to just walk into your presence and know the healing that comes from you and you alone. Oh, Father God, this is our prayer as you heal disappointment this morning. Lord, this is our prayer as you start us on that road. This year, Lord, this year is our year of healing, Lord. This year is our year where we become the men and women you have destined for us to become. This is the year where we move past those disappointments in our life into fullness of joy and rivers of living water. This is our year, Lord, the acceptable year of the Lord in our lives. And we pray this in Jesus' precious, precious name. Amen. Church, let's be seated and let's get your communion cup. Would you do that? As you're finding this little cup, if you're watching, listening online, turn your coffee into communion and your toast into the bread. You know, I always think about Jesus because he's so important to me. I thought, could you imagine how disappointed Jesus was in Peter? How disappointed Jesus was in that dear guy that betrayed him, and Judas. Sometimes I imagine how disappointed he could be in me. And yet he hung on that cross. He hung on that cross to say, listen, disappointment doesn't need to define you. Disappointment doesn't define you. My life, my risen life defines you. Because death, which really is disappointment, couldn't hold him in the grave. Death, which is really disappointment, couldn't keep him there. On the third day, he rose again, and his spirit comes to live in each of us. Today, as we take this cup, and this bread, let's just, if this is you today, let's just say, Lord, I'm not going to allow disappointment to define my life anymore. I'm going to be defined by your life, by your healing, by streams of living water. Let's eat together. We all know that sometimes we don't bleed, but we've all shed enough tears, right? Those tears that come from deep, deep, deep within us. Those tears that come from deep disappointment. Might as well be blood. Jesus said, listen, I shed my blood for you. I've shed it for you. This is yours. Take it, drink, live, become who you're destined to become. Let's drink.
Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will.